Welcome back, and we're moving to our next speaker, IQ Said, who is the co-founder and of a well-known company, Cirque, where he leads the engineering, product, data, and design teams. I'm for you, IQ, and I will leave you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's a little bit new world order where you can't see all your audience. It's all remote, but such are the times. Thank you to the organizers for making this happen in spite of the challenges. Again, I'm IQ. I started on this journey of micromobility close to 2 years ago. The company in late 2018, and I joined the company in March last year, so March 2019. And to give you a little bit of context, in January, our company was acquired by Bird. Bird is one of the two biggest global players in micromobility space, based out of US. And since then, we have transitioned more or less fully to the Bird. I'll talk about the micromobility business in general, give you an overview, and then speak of some of the tech that is enabling it, and what are the different challenges and the journey that we have gone through. Now, a lot has already been talked about how car is not really the best mode of transportation for all urban mobility use cases. It does serve a very critical purpose. I was part of Careem, the biggest ride-hailing company out of Middle East region for a while, built out the engineering team there, and we saw what a difference it makes for people, for drivers, in creating jobs and so on. But car has limitations. The overall transportation use case that car was able to, or ride hailing was able to solve, was less than 1%. And then it started to hit the saturation point. The reason is that the car is hard to afford for most people, but also car has various other issues as well. For instance, a few KPIs here. More than half the trips are less than 2 kilometers. Most of the heavy majority of the trips are single occupancy, just one person sitting in the car, and most of the time the car is not even moving much. There is a stat that about 50 minutes are spent every day by Americans on average in car, just like waiting. There is another very interesting stat that in New York City, there's more space dedicated to sleeping cars than sleeping people. So obviously there is something wrong with that situation. We built our cities around a certain transportation mode, but it has kind of outlived the modern needs. So what are the alternatives? Obviously, there is a lot of experimentation that will be done over the next few years. Micromobility in general is a relatively new space. It really took off only in 2016 or around that time frame. Scooters and e-scooters and e-bikes have been the two primary vehicles that have been experimented with in this space. Here is a little bit of an overview of that. So the alternatives to car have to be much smaller in footprint, more or less personal, as we saw that most of the car trips are single occupancy anyway, and a lot more efficient in terms of energy and cost as well. So there are lots of things that have gone into making electric scooters happen, or smaller vehicles happen. And I highlight a few things here. So for example, there are now smaller size, high-powered motors that you can have in these smaller vehicles. There are very powerful batteries now, obviously, thanks to a lot of work that has also been done in the space of mobility or phones. or mobiles, phones, the cars, for instance, electric cars. And now we are benefiting from that in a lot of other spaces as well, including personal mobility. And then last but not the least, there have been quite a bit of work that has happened in the IoT space. So the electronic devices that are needed for shared mobility, where you can lock, unlock, or the consumer can lock, unlock remotely without having to have a key or without having to have a person give you electric scooter. That technology is now miniaturized so that it can fit into this scooter, and also is a lot more reliable, and also doesn't cost as much as it used to. So these scooters are in general connected with the backend, and that backend is then used to communicate with the app as well as the scooter. And when the user wants to rent it out, they slide a bar on the app or press a button, and the scooter is unlocked and they are able to take a ride. And then this ride is like metered in terms of time or in terms of distance, and the user is charged based on that with the payment method that is registered within the app. So this is a little bit of an overview. Primarily, the technologies that go into making these things happen have progressed in the last 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years, and to bring us to this point where something like this is possible. I want to make sure that we don't think of scooters as equivalent to micromobility. Micromobility is a lot more than just scooter. Scooter is just the first device. In the future, you can expect to have a lot more devices. As you can imagine, scooter cannot really solve a lot of the problems that other transportation modes can. So it's not very weatherproof. You cannot really carry weight with yourself, so cargo. You can carry maybe a backpack, but not more than that. And so it's not necessarily fully optimized for a lot of use cases. So the personal electric vehicles of the future can be expected to support these things as well, where you can carry some cargo. Maybe like there's a compartment where you can store something. And also be a little bit more weatherproof, so it may be covered. Lots of parts in the world are very cold or very hot, or it rains a lot. So in order to enable round the year use case of personal mobility, we would have to design vehicles that can cover some of those use cases as well. Micromobility has been talked about a lot. It's been in the news. It's been all over everywhere. You see scooters on the streets. It has taken off at a very rapid pace. And one could ask the question, how come it has grown so fast? So obviously, there has been a lot of money put into this as well. That helps. But there are some other reasons as well. I would highlight two reasons why micromobility has grown about like at 100x of ride-hailing companies like Uber or Lyft. So one reason is obviously that there was a great prior market fit. These vehicles don't need any advertising. They are outside, right out there. They are relatively easy to use, so the adoption is relatively easy. And also there has been a huge need for vehicles like that. So you don't have to convince people a lot to use these vehicles. The other big reason is that with a platform like ride hailing, you have two sides of the platform or the marketplace. You have consumers and you have providers, or so-called drivers, or the cars themselves. So when you have a two-sided marketplace, it's very challenging to build it out such that you have the demand and the supply roughly matching with each other. And you have to then incentivize both sides to make it happen. And that's one reason that ride-hailing companies are also very cash heavy or cash intensive. So they burn money a lot for a long time. And then when you really figure out the right balance, then you can make money. But it takes a long time and it's very tricky. With micromobility, you can say that there are two sides of the equation. There is the consumer, and then there is the supply, the scooters themselves. But you don't need to recruit scooters like you need to in case of ride hailing. You need to recruit drivers and cars. But obviously, it takes capex. You have to spend money to buy those scooters. And then what is critical for the business is then to make sure that the vehicles are economical enough and your operations are economical enough that you can make money from it, that you have positive unit economics. That's a pretty big challenge. And obviously, lots of things go into it. The overall economy or market, like what the labor costs are like in a certain space, that plays into it, how good your ops team is. But tech also plays a crucial role in making ops very efficient as well. And we will talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Some of you may also have the question in mind how it plays out with the whole COVID situation. Are people still using personal vehicles? What is the future of that? So here I have a few data points with regards to that. So the coronavirus pandemic has definitely impacted the whole overall industry quite badly, actually, at least during the lockdowns. So most of the micromobility companies ceased their operation, so they pulled back the fleets, and the business went virtually down to zero. But as the lockdowns are being lifted, you are seeing a resurgence of the micromobility use. And it's on many fronts. The consumers are also obviously like starting to use them. The reason we can only speculate, but likely is that some of the other modes of transportation involve interacting with other people. So personal mobility, like with scooters or e-bikes, it's you are by yourself. You are touching the handles and the scooter overall, but the micromobility operators are also doing a lot of things to help with that. For example, they have these disposable wipes that they are attaching to the scooter, and you can use it in a per use fashion to clean the handles, for instance. So it's relatively easy to make sure that the scooters are sanitized or e-bikes are sanitized. It's relatively harder to ensure those things in the modes of transportation which involve interaction with other people. Similarly, governments are also helping grow this as well. For instance, a lot of cities around the world have added a lot of bike lanes to their cities. Now, obviously, this is for personal bike owners as well, but it also helps micromobility, shared micromobility too. Moving on, let me mention a few key success factors for micromobility. You need to have vehicles and supply chain that is reliable and produces a scooter that is durable. I mentioned earlier that there is significant amount of capex involved. If the vehicles don't last a significant amount of time, then you couldn't possibly have a business that makes sense. So you need a reliable supply chain where you can supply scooters based on like what the demand is like and source them. The scooters need to be very reliable and they need to be extremely safe. If you have just a few accidents, that can mean that your consumers can be very concerned, and also the municipality and regulation could be very concerned with that. Your operations need to be very efficient. It's a very labor-extensive business as well. You have drivers who are or blue-collar workers who take your vehicles and deploy them, and also then go back and collect them when they're out of charge or broken. So you need to have these operations run in such a way that it makes sense in terms of unit economics. That the money that you're making per ride from the scooters balances off the cost of doing those operations as well as buying the scooters. You need to have a very close relationship with the cities and other business partners. Cities have much more heavily regulated this space than they did the ride-hailing space. in ride-hailing early on, they were relatively lax and realized that they should have been more careful with how the ride-hailing was regulated. So with the scooters, they have been a bit more aggressive, and it makes sense in a lot of ways. It's the scooters are operated on public property. They can cause a lot of clutter in your cities as well. So virtually all the micromobility operators and my company Circ in the past has worked very closely with the cities to make sure that we are deploying the scooters in the places where it makes sense, where the city is okay with that. And also the number of scooters are consistent with what the city feels comfortable with. And also there have been, this has been enabled by tech as well. So we have API integrations with the cities where we provide data so that there is transparency as to where the scooters are and how they are being used. It's important to have an exponential on commercial model, which can help scale better. So what we did was that we had dedicated launch teams that would go into a city when we were going to launch, and they would use the best practices of launching a new city, so that you can educate the cities and municipalities, and also ease the consumers into using the scooters. And then obviously tech and product, which also plays a very crucial role. Obviously, this is the touch point that most of the consumers and even most of the internal blue collar workers use to interact with your business offering. I mentioned scooter earlier, like you saw a model. We worked on this first pillar of vehicle and supply chain, and for the evolved our scooter designs. So here you can see a model which has a swappable battery. So it's a lot more durable. It has a better battery capacity, but also it's a swappable battery. So what this means is that our blue collar workers, when they go out into the city, they don't have to bring the scooters back into the warehouses to charge them. Instead, they can just swap the battery and bring the discharged batteries into the warehouses. This makes operations a lot more efficient, and in turn plays into the unit economics with respect to operations that I mentioned earlier. I would love to take some questions at this point, but I think I should just wait till the end. Hopefully it all makes sense. Let me go through a little bit more about the tech and AI that we built to make these things happen. This is, I believe, a bit more interesting piece than, for example, going very deep into the battery or the operations space. So one of the most important things with respect to the tech for micromobility is to build systems that can scale and are reliable. So some of the things that we did in order to make that happen was that we had a modular architecture. So as we scale, we add more engineers into our teams. They would be able to work on different pieces. And a few other concerns. And let me go a little bit into the details of that on the respective slides. When you're building a startup like this, you go through a lot of different emotions. This slide kind of like captures that that piece. That initially you are very optimistic and upbeat. You think you can do it all and overcome all challenges, and then you run into some unpleasant surprises. You realize that these challenges are a lot more difficult. You have fires that you need to fight. You have moments of despair as well, but then you come up with inventive solutions to the problems, and ultimately, obviously, you prevail. The key to all of this, or the success in the end, is that you have the right people and the right attitude and a vision or mission that drives everything. So this is the journey of an entrepreneur or anyone who's building tech, obviously. And it's always good to keep in mind when you're going through a certain emotion, that when you are elated, that it's not necessarily always going to be like that. But when you are down and under and feeling some despair that that also it's not a permanent state. You will figure it out, solutions to that, as long as I mentioned, that you are driven by a mission and you have talented people working in your teams. I mentioned modular architecture. So this basically a rendering which shows you how we achieved that. So we had a microservices-based backend where each service takes care of a given concern. For example, payments are separate from the consumer registration, and that is separate from, for example, the whole scooter rental flow. So these kinds of modularizations help you reason about the system better, and also when you are hiring more engineers and onboarding them, and then they go on to tackle some complex challenges, it's easier for them to focus on just one piece and not have to deal with everything in the system. The visibility is important. Visibility here means that you can see how your system is doing, and you have metrics or probes or KPIs into the system. This is often referred to as, for example, APM as well, and monitorability or logging and profiling and so on. So they all fall into that space. There are lots of off-the-shelf solutions these days that you can use. We, for example, use Datadog. This really helps you with having visibility into how your system is doing, how the different services are interacting, where you have errors happening, and looking at the logs and so on, so that when there is an issue, you can really pinpoint where the problem is and then be able to resolve it. Asynchronous flow through your system is really helpful. What that means is that between the users all the way back to the backend, and then onto the scooter, and then back all the way to the user, that you want to have a largely asynchronous system. So when the user makes a request, that request is not pending in the system, because every pending request takes a lot of resources. So the way you build it is that you, for example, queue everything in your system. And then you are dealing with those things, or your services are dealing with those things, or the pieces of code that are running in the backend, they are dealing with those things as when they become free or when they are able to. So there isn't a lot of resources tied up serving those requests, and they get handled in an asynchronous way, and then you push messages to wherever they need to, like, for example, to a scooter or back to the user. So this messages-based asynchronous system allows you to build a system that is relatively efficient in resources and is a lot more performant and responsive to the user. Then the aspect of horizontal scalability or elasticity. So this plays into two things. One, when you have a lot more scooters or a lot more users, you want to be able to scale out the system such that you can handle the load in your system. So when you have a lot more requests coming in from the user, or you are listening to a lot of scooters, you have a lot more load in the system. And if you could not scale it out in a horizontal way, meaning like by creating more instances or copies of your backend services, then you wouldn't be able to easily handle that load. The other aspect is that this elasticity also gives you better efficiency in terms of cost. So if, let's say, that you couldn't scale up and down based on demand, then you would always have to have a very large system so that you can handle peak load. And then you would end up with huge costs, which again, as I mentioned earlier, would not play so well into your unit economics. In order to have a sustainable business, you need a high level of elasticity in your backend systems, and similarly in your operations and everywhere else as well. So these were a few principles that we used to build a system right from the beginning, such that when we see very high load or a lot of customers and a lot of scooters, we would be able to handle it in a reliable fashion. And it eventually paid off, because it did happen that obviously, like, we grew a lot. We had more than 1 million customers, actually close to 2 million. We had tens of thousands of scooters in the system, and we were able to handle that demand reliably. In the interest of time, I'll go through this like really quickly. So far we talked about real-time aspect of the system where the user makes a request, unlocks a scooter, takes a ride. But there is a lot more that happens behind the scenes offline as well. So we are collecting all the data. We are using that data for a lot of interesting things. For example, we figure out where we should deploy the scooters. This is an image of Paris. It shows the hotspots where you would deploy the scooters. And how do we figure that out? We, at a high level, it's a little bit of a simplistic image, but we use kind of like a heat map. So we look at where the highest demand is, and based on that, we figure out where to deploy the scooters. This is a rendering of the usage pattern of the scooter. So this kind of like shows what are the points where people start their rides and end their rides. And as you can see that by deploying your scooters in places such that you can satisfy most of the demand, you can have a system where you're getting a lot more rides, and also you are having better circulation of those scooters throughout the city based on the most common usage patterns visited. This is also very helpful in working with the cities. We can show the city or municipality how to plan their transportation systems or infrastructure for other modes like mass transit as well, such that it caters to the public needs. There are lots of things where we applied AI or machine learning as well. One of the problems is deployment optimization. As I mentioned, the simplistic view was that we use heat maps, but really it's a question of like revenue optimization. So you can figure out what are the spots where if you deployed your scooters, you would get the highest amount of revenue through multiple rides that may start initially in that particular deployment spot. So you use quite a few data points and use that to train models that that let you know what are the hotspots where you should be deploying. And also, you can work out the routes that your blue-collar workers should be taking to pick up the scooters that have been discharged. So this routing optimization also helps with keeping the operations very efficient. There are quite a few things that you go into figuring out the right product. For instance, looking at a little bit of the product perspective, we had external customers, but also internal customers, and very different class or personas as well. So you look at the UX design from the perspective of all these different customers and figure out what the product should be like. In terms of organization, we had cross-functional teams, which were per domain, which allowed us to manage the complexity of the system as well as organization as well. So these teams were owned their own mandate. They would figure out or set the goals at a quarterly level themselves and then try to achieve them. And lastly, culture and values are really important. So we had a set of values which helped us execute in a relatively independent manner, where the teams took a lot of ownership and figured out the right product and features themselves and iterated over that to help achieve the mission that we wanted to achieve. So there is obviously like there was a lot of things here, and I could go into a lot more detail, but this should give you a high-level perspective of what micromobility is about, how tech enables all of it, what are the different types of challenges that we have to address, because obviously looking outside in, it seems like micromobility wouldn't be something that would be very tech-heavy, but I touched upon a few topics which help understand or get some insights into all the various places where tech plays a crucial role in making the new modes of transportation a reality. So thank you, and I would be happy to answer some questions.
Hey, thank you for your interesting talk. I think this topic was very important for Georgians, and I think we have some questions related to that. The first question is, recently Tbilisi City Hall added e-scooters in Uptown as an alternative transport. Based on the global and your experience, what is a better way to promote micromobility through the private or public sectors?
Yeah, a very good question. I would say that a private enterprise should work very closely with the city, municipality or city hall in figuring out what the needs of the city are and how they should be addressed. And from the city perspective, I would say this is, I actually didn't know about this, but this is great news. I would say that Tbilisi must be a lot more progressive than a lot of other cities. A lot of other cities have also seen it as a little bit of like threatening to the city landscape, but they are also coming around pretty much globally and seeing the value of micromobility. I think initially it also got a pretty bad rap from the fact that a lot of companies over deployed the scooters. So there was a lot of, or bikes of various types. So there was a lot of clutter in the city, and that didn't really help create the right image for this mode. So now I think everybody, both private and public sector, is taking a lot more educated, informed approach and balanced approach to this thing. So I think that I would say that a few things that matter quite a bit is to figure out what the whole ecosystem is. So, for example, approach micromobility also from as a complementary mode to public transport. So, for instance, look at deploying micromobility closer to public transit places or stations, so bus stops and train stations or metro stations, and see it as an enabler of public transport. And also, this is something that we were also doing, that doing integrations with the public transport apps. So the city can have integrations where, for example, private providers can have deep links into the app, and consumer can see scooters and take rides or book scooters or e-bikes, which would help increase the adoption of public transport or access to public transport, but at the same time solve the first and last mile problem for people as well.
And we have another question to that. I have met many startups creating micromobility and other so-called smart city solutions, and they were always going to sell it to the local municipalities and scale through such in other countries. But sometimes it is very hard and long to get any approval from the government, and sometimes they just don't have budget for those solutions. What do you think would be a better way for these startups to sell? Which model is better for them?
Good question. So I think I kind of like partly addressed this thing. It's crucial to work with the cities regardless. So if they are being slow and have not yet allowed you to operate, there are some cities, actually most of the cities, where it's not regulated yet. So you could actually start operating the scooters in a very, I should say, conservative way. So deploy a few scooters through the city and see what the adoption is like. So a lot of cities don't have it regulated. So if the city has not yet regulated it, meaning like they have no say, really not figured out like whether they like it or don't like it, you can actually start operating, but be careful in like, how crazy you want to go with it. So start small and then start to grow it. The other thing is that in some cities it's heavily regulated, in which case there are a few other options. You can actually find private spaces where you may still be able to operate. So city can only regulate the public spaces, but if you work with private real estate providers, assuming such opportunities exist. So for example, we operated in Abu Dhabi and UAE as well. And there are large real estate developers who have these spaces where public regulation doesn't exactly apply. So you can actually operate scooters there to provide a convenient mode of transport to the residents of those spaces. So those are a few things that you could do. But generally speaking, I think it's very important to have an open mind and like be flexible about this thing and be inventive. I think every place has its own flavor of like what you need to do to exactly make it happen. Maybe the city can also you can help them understand, but also like incentivize them. So in some places you do a little bit of revenue share with the city as well, so that both parties can benefit. This was very common or has been very common with ride hailing, so it could work with micromobility too. But obviously, the unit economics of micromobility are also important. You want to have a profitable business. So yeah, it's important. It's tricky to balance all those concerns, and that's why there is a lot of room for entrepreneurship in this space.
Yes, thank you. We have some more questions. How convenient are e-scooters in long distance, and how can it be improved? Like, for example, I myself had an experience. I rode the e-scooter for a long distance, and the battery died, so I have to change it.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Good question. So they are most optimal for relatively short rides. They can be used for longer rides, maybe like intermediate distance, but definitely not very long distance. So aside from the battery concern, there's obviously like they are not super comfortable for very long rides, especially like in some cities in Europe where you have cobblestone. It can be really jarring to take very long rides through those cobblestone streets. So there are a couple of things. One, that there's a lot of work being done on the, for example, the battery front, so that the batteries can charge can last much longer, and also on operational front, such that these scooters that run out of battery can be served better. And also having a bigger supply also helps. So for example, if your scooter does happen to run out of battery, you can find another scooter relatively quickly and nearby. On the comfort front, there has been quite a bit of work as well, specifically around the tires and also suspension. So the newer scooters are a lot more comfortable in terms of suspension. So that also helps. But definitely, this is not a mode of transport that can completely replace public transport or bigger motorized vehicles. This is meant largely for first and last mile solutions, so relatively shorter distances.
And I think we have one more question about the future of e-scooters. As you've mentioned, the technology progresses, micromobility is becoming more affordable and flexible to use. What do you think? Will it replace cars in some way, for example, for one-person households?
So scooters, almost certainly not, but micromobility, my vision at least, or strong belief, is that almost certainly yes. I think the micromobility vehicles of the future are likely going to look fairly different from today's scooter, or at least the previous generation scooter. They have to, as I mentioned, like solve, or we have to solve some problems there, like make it a little bit more weatherproof, make it possible to carry some cargo, and also make it a bit more comfortable as well, so that they can go a little bit longer distances. So once those issues are solved, I think that solving these issues would mean that the vehicle would look a bit different than what it looks today. We don't know exactly what it would be like, but cars are definitely not the solution. Increasingly, everybody is realizing that you cannot solve the transportation problem everywhere, especially like, for example, if you look at third world, most of the people don't even have access to car. But as soon as you get access to transport, it can really change and turn around people's lives, because now they can go to work at a longer distance from where they live. They can do a lot more things. They have access to a lot of more resources that way. So there is a problem here that needs to be solved. Scooter is one attempt at it, but I think micromobility overall is going to take a few more stabs at it and figure out the right kind of vehicle to address it in the future.
And I have one last question. Are there any issues with the risk of scooters being damaged? And if so, can they be neutralized somehow?
Yeah, I think one big issue obviously is that the risk of vandalism and theft. So in some cities around the world, we have seen a lot of vandalism and loss of scooters, which obviously hurts the business to the point where, in some cases, the companies pulled out of those cities. Unfortunately, Paris is one of the cities where the loss or the theft, for instance, is very high. Partly, it's also because certain cities don't, or people within those cities don't take favorably to scooters. They just don't like the idea of having scooters in the city, so they they end up destroying and in some cases throwing them into the rivers and so on, which is very sad and unfortunate. So there are lots of challenges with this. Some of these can be addressed with the technology as well. For example, you can reduce the loss and theft to some extent by having the right tracking of those scooters, so you can find where exactly they are, even if they have been picked up, like for example, stolen or abandoned somewhere. But some of this is responsibility of the cities and the companies as well to educate people better, to make the scooters long lasting so that they are not being broken and damaged. And the city and the companies are also doing it in such a way that you're not deploying in excess of it, so as to make sure that there isn't a reaction against them from either the city or from the public. So yeah, there are quite a few technological challenges, industrial engineering challenges with respect to the design of the scooter, the tracking of the scooter, but a lot which is outside of tech or technology and lies with the people and education as well.
Thank you. I think this information will be very useful for us Georgians. So I guess we will now have a break for some time and then move to next speaker.
Awesome. Thank you for the opportunity, and feel free to reach out to me anywhere on LinkedIn or elsewhere. Thank you.
Yes. Hope to see you soon. Keep in touch.
Likewise.
Thank you.
Bye.